This is Pixelish. I'm your host, Wolfgang Bremer. Today I'm welcoming Josh Chisholm, a senior designer focusing on design systems at Reddit with previous roles at Google and SAP. We are talking about technical design roles, how design systems can enable us without limiting us, what seniority in design means, the Peter principle, how to work better remotely, and more. Josh, it's so great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for coming.
No worries. I'm really happy to be here, Wolfgang. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it's so great to have you. I was just thinking, when is the last time we actually talked? It must be, I want to say years ago, but I can't really, I don't even remember.
Yeah, I don't remember. I think the last time we must have actually properly sat down was 2018, I think then.
2018. Is that when you left SAP in 2018?
That's right. Yeah, I left
Wow.
SAP in the fall. Yeah.
Wow. And now it's almost, I want to say the end of 2021, almost. I mean, you can already
Yeah.
buy Christmas cookies in the grocery stores over here. So it's feels really odd, I must say. But
Yeah.
it's been a long time. So how have you been?
I've been pretty good. Yeah. It's been a busy few years. Was living down in Seattle there for a bit, working over at Google. Was down there and doing remote long distance with my girlfriend in Vancouver. And then the pandemic hit and was down there for, I think a good solid year. And then decided to make my way back to Vancouver and found a new job and have kind of replanted myself in the hometown.
Wow, amazing. So you have been up to lots of different things. I mean, we met while we were both working at SAP, and then you left SAP to work for Google, and now you are off to new adventures. So I was really curious, I don't know, especially as a designer, and I hope many designers will be listening. What is it like to work at SAP? What is it like to work at Google? What is it like to work at Reddit? Can you dive a little bit into this, talk about this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm especially thankful for all the opportunities that have come my way, and they're all really great and quite different in their own ways. So, I mean, SAP felt, funny to say it now, but it felt smaller than than Google for sure. But SAP gave me a lot of good exposure to, I think, working at scale and just seeing the breadth of that your design, or that's not the right word, but the amount of people it can impact with the amount of customers SAP has, and just the scale of business B2B software was something that I never fully, I don't even think understood was out there until working at SAP.
Right.
And how complex it could be. But I loved and I miss our little design team. It felt, really solid and like a little family. And I miss that little office that we had there in Yaletown.
Right.
And then Google was a big kind of shift, leaving SAP for a similar size company, but the design maturity is, very mature at Google. They developed material design. UX is something that I was always surprised how much engineers and developers cared about it and really wanted to make sure that we were all delivering the best experience, which was, not something that I don't think you get everywhere. It can be it's a really nice change of pace to get that feeling. And then with Google, everything, it kind of comes with the crazy office, the little bit over the top experience of tech, with the crazy massage chairs and food cafeterias that somehow never ends and stuff like that.
Beautiful.
And then Reddit's been probably the most different of all of them. I got myself kind of made a transition into consumer software. So working on the Reddit platform, specifically on the design systems team. And I've just been working out of my bedroom for the last 3 months. So I've never actually met anyone in person, and it's super surreal.
I can imagine. I mean, back in I don't know, I guess before the pandemic, it was, at least from my point of view, it was like there were a few companies, who would allow remote work.
Mm-hmm.
And now majority, I want to say, of the world is not forced to do remote work, but forced to work from their bedrooms, or from their places, depending. And it's just, I don't know, it's mind boggling. You just sit at home, you walk from the kitchen, I guess, to the bedroom kind of thing. And then if you're like one of the days, especially in Vancouver or Seattle, if it's a bit rainy, you might not leave the house, and then you're just, well, you don't even commute anymore. Really.
Yeah, it can be a little depressing when it gets to that point. You're like, okay, I need to leave the house. I need to go for a walk, get some fresh air, grab a coffee. But yeah, it has its ups and downs, its pros and cons for sure. But it's been a nice way of staying really focused on the work. I mean, that sounds maybe counterintuitive or maybe not the norm, but there's less distractions than an office environment. So I've come to appreciate that about just having heads down time at home. But now I have 2 kittens that run around the house doing parkour off the walls.
Oh, sweet.
And they keep me a little bit busy during the day.
Yeah, for sure. But it's also, as you said, it's a good distraction, something to take care of, and gives a good feeling. And that's nice. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Cool. So I know at SAP you usually worked at quite complex topics, I want to say. I'm not sure how to phrase it, but I find if I speak to younger designers, their mindset often seems to be focused on visual things, stuff you see, something, I'm not sure how to phrase it, something air quotes tangible.
Yep.
But I almost feel a lot of the work you did, especially, I know about it, SAP, is very, I guess I want to say technical, and not so much what many designers maybe would want to work on. I'm not sure how to phrase it, because I think it's really important, the work you did and you're still doing, but it's also on a different level. Maybe that's the right way. I don't know. Maybe you can dive a little bit into this.
Yeah, that's a great prompt. I think it's funny. I don't think I really. It's one of those things that just happened in my career. I was like, oh, I guess I'm working on another technical project, or it's systems like. And I do think I'm drawn to some of those complex user journeys and trying to create an experience out of them. I think at SAP, maybe when we were working together, I always made a joke that, we work on like the invisible and make the invisible something visible. So at SAP, I was working on some automated dashboarding tools that would use machine learning algorithms that you would point at a data set and it would go and try to find the insights from that data.
Right.
And it's not something that comes intuitive to a designer. Like, how do you design a UI for a regression model or a classification model? And then how do you visualize it? Those things are, at least the visualization part is more practiced. Data visualization is, there's lots of inspiration and precedents to look at, but I always found a nice challenge working in those like setup tasks of create, how does a user go through the workflow of configuring all the knobs and dials? And I think that's kind of what drew me into systems design and just systems thinking, and becoming a little bit more obsessed with trying to understand how to think at scale and how we design these different systems and they're all interconnected. And then we've created something that is bigger than our minds can wrap our heads around and then have to work on that.
That's a great way of phrasing it.
Yes, right. Well, I'm glad. At Google, I was working on search stuff as well. So Google search, but not Google search. I was working on the cloud platform search.
Right.
So in Google Cloud Platforms ecosystem, they have like infrastructure technology for running compute or like computers, CPUs. Do you want to rent a CPU from Google? Storage solutions. They have out-of-the-box AI stuff as well. Bunch of security and networking tools, but all of that it's all at the end of the day technology, but they developed this, front end console or portal to manage all of that infrastructure that you're creating. And then I worked on the little search bar at the top of that experience. But that was one of the biggest, I think one of the hardest things I've had to do so far is that search for a tool like that. And visually, it's simple. You have a little search bar, and it shows results inside of the search bar or in the results pane. And it's got an icon and text. And the design's done. But then what you're really trying to figure out is, what are people trying to do? What are they searching? What are they typing? Where should we lead them? What kind of information do we pull? And then the hardest part about all of that work was that it was... we were not able to actually look at people's queries like you can do in Google search and do analysis and develop models to make it smarter and smarter, because Google Cloud is all B2B. We're not allowed to look at what people are typing into it. So we had to do a lot of research and kind of iterate, develop workflows.
Wow, that's really complex. So doing research, I mean, I remember at SAP, it was not easy to find the right research participants. Either if you have clients you work with, they are obviously all busy because they're working. So they often don't want to spend time with a company giving them, I'm going to say, air quotes, free time to give feedback and all these kind of things.
Yep.
And then on the other hand, finding the proper participants outside of the company is really hard, because it's you need very specific people, right? Very specific users, and not just like, I often find, I mean, it of course always depends on one designer works on, but if you have, I don't know, a B2C product, designers tend to think in an overly simplistic way. Oh, let's just go to Starbucks, and ask a bunch of questions to random people, because most of them probably will have used, I don't know, let's say a mapping application, a payment application, or FaceTime or what. But software like you were working on, it's not so easy to find these people. So do you have any tips or tricks? How would you go about finding these kind of people?
Yeah, that is a good question, Wolfgang. Unfortunately, I don't know if my answer is going to be good, but we had at Google, we had a team of recruiters that would source people. And so all we had to do is give a little profile on who we wanted to find, what kind of size of company they might work at, what their tasks are in the cloud development world, if they're more security focused, networking focused, or just app development. And then if they had experience with our tool or with competitors like AWS. And it took a while. That was probably the one realization, was how slow proper good research can be to find those particular, participants.
Yes.
And I think you're totally right, because when you run studies like that, you can just get anyone, but maybe they've used it once or twice, but if they're not really a power user, or it's not something they would do day to day, you're just going to get muddy data that's not really going to help indicate, what you're looking at. Maybe there is like a distinction we can make. And please stop me if I'm just rambling too much, but
no, that's great.
I was going to say I guess if the research is strategic and foundational, or just tactical, and we're just user testing a UI. And that's something I think when I would work with researchers, we would, have that conversation. What are we looking to evaluate at this time? Are we looking for directional feedback and more strategic research? Then finding the right people is really, really important. Whereas if we're just wanting to vet a UI, make sure it's usable, and, test a few different concepts, it could be a little bit, more lenient with finding people. Google was big enough that we could look internally, because there are internal customers as well, because all of the different product areas will actually use Google Cloud to develop their software. So we did that once or twice just to get really quick results. It is tough to find the right people. I think especially in B2B, it can be about developing that relationship with the client and then getting them to pass along the right people, and not interviewing them. I think we ran into that problem at SAP a lot, where we would have our customers and then we'd get put in contact with them, and they're really just the buyers of the software. They're not actually the users of the software, which is a tough one.
Yeah. But I mean, it's
and very different from Reddit. Very different.
Oh, I want to ask about that in a second as well. But so what I want to say is that is, of course, a beautiful situation you have there at Google. I want to say the luxury of having a dedicated team who have like all the experts you can talk to, and then they go out, as you mentioned, find the proper people to do the testing with. And as you mentioned, proper research usually takes time. It's not, yes, I know we want to ship, everybody wants to ship every 2 weeks, sure. And then often the expectation is, yeah, so you have 2 weeks, it's like, that's not how it works. And I find it sometimes, depending on of course, the maturity of the company, and I want to say how experienced the people are working with designers and working with a design team, how much they know about these kind of things, plays a big role in these things. And I remember during my time at Nokia, in Nokia Services, we also had a dedicated research team. And we were super lucky and happy to have them, because we would also go to them, as you described, and say, hey, we really want to test this because we are just not sure, because how can we be sure? Yes. So we would sit down with them, had a kickoff workshop, and describe them what we are thinking about building or designing, I guess, and ask them their opinions. And often they have so much information already from all the research they did over the last month and years, that they can straight off the bat already answer some of your questions right away, because they just know.
Yeah, exactly.
And then if it's something specific, they say, okay, that's great. Thanks for coming to us and not just building something, because what's the point? Yep. And then they go out and they source and they find the people. And then we used to have a proper research lab, like with this glass/mirror wall where you can go in and see and record and all these things. Yeah. And it's, to me, the first time it was mind blowing. And then, some other companies, or when you read the news, I don't remember which company it was, but where they said, like, oh, we have to downsize, we fire majority of the research team, and to me it's like, oh my goodness, it's almost like what you're going to build without knowing, how can you, I don't know, it's just incomprehensible sometimes. So I think it's really great to have the maturity to see that this makes sense, to have dedicated people to do research, and even maybe at a smaller scale, if you're not a Google, but maybe have one dedicated person who supports the rest of the team if it's a small team. And I think this is not only important for the designers, but also for the rest of the company, to actually explain to them, design is not just making things pretty. Design is so much more.
Exactly. That's beautifully said. Like, I think the importance of having a dedicated research team is so invaluable. I don't know how I would go back to the alternative and then be able to manage all that work. And I think that's like the hardest part, is it's such a mode shift. Right. And I think designers can certainly, we can run a usability study. That's okay. We're at risk of having bias affect the results if we're the ones that designed and then have to research it. But for really do good, solid, strategic, directional research, I think that takes time and that takes a dedication, and your head has to be in it. And then something else that I've been learned and was very grateful to have at Google was the different specialties of researchers. So having quantitative and qualitative researchers.
Right.
So it's interesting. I work with some folks that were they had psychology PhDs, and they'd be more on the qualitative side. And then there'd be the actual quantitative researchers with data science backgrounds that just have a love for UX and then use their skills to help us out on building good products. And quantitative research is just a superpower, to be able to use data tools to analyze users at scale and their behavior is just amazing. But I guess the caveat, if I were to ramble a little bit more here, is that
please go ahead.
Data is always great to tell us what happened, but it doesn't really always help us know where to go.
Right.
It can help us make sense of the past, but not always make sense of the future. And especially when looking at like metric-based data, it's not really able to tell us what we don't have, which qualitative does.
Right. Great. So now coming back to what you mentioned earlier between like B2B and B2C, so how are things are Reddit and how are things different?
Yeah, that's a great question. The pace is much, much faster. And
Okay.
I think that's expected. I always I like to make a joke that Google is like a really big freighter or cruise ship. You know, when it
Hmm.
turns, it takes a while for the thing to turn,
Right.
because it's large and there's smaller teams, you know, the at the company that work on smaller products, and I think they can be a little bit more agile. But on the big products like cloud and search and YouTube, those things can move pretty slow. Where Reddit is agile and it's, you know, pre-IPO, it's trying to really make its, you know, big stand on the front stage, and so things are moving faster. There's a need for rapid research, and that's a program we're trying to develop right now, or the research team is developing, where we can get like a rolling research studies happening, which is really interesting. So, I mean, one advantage to Reddit is the users are public. I mean, you can just drop on and contact people out of the blue and say whether or not they'd want to participate in a user study.
Yes.
Or there's moderators of the communities, and there's a whole community and system in place to connect with moderators and
Right.
get feedback from them on the communities they manage. So those, it's a lot easier to find people for Reddit, I'd say, and then it's just about trying to build a cadence to get stuff in front of people and get feedback from it.
Wow. Yeah. Sounds very different. And yeah, sounds much more, as you described, like I want to say smaller company, but also like probably a difference between B2B and B2C and then pre-IPO, like all the things you say,
Exactly.
And I think the analogy you use, like a big freighter, it's like the big ship. That makes total sense. I remember when I interviewed at SAP, somebody told me, yeah, it's SAP, but we're like a startup within the enterprise. And I don't know, I want to say people joke about this, but I also felt it was true, at least to a degree, like within the team.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we shipped every 2 weeks, and all these kind of things. And we had to make sure that things were in quality, or at least at some point, we had to focus more on quality than on the pace, I want to say. So it felt like we could do things. But then, of course, there were situations where like,
Yeah.
yeah, but now we really depend on the air quotes mothership. I don't know, to make maybe, let's say, legal decisions, or usually these kind of decisions where, yeah, which might be more important or very important on a large scale, and which just takes some time to align people and to start by finding the right people, within a company, hundreds of
Mm-hmm.
thousands of people, and assume it's similar at Google. And then Reddit is totally different, as you describe.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can talk about it, what kind of topics are you working on at Reddit? Is it also complex things, or is there some kind of shift for you as a professional, or what are you doing?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a shift. I'm working on the foundations team. It's a new team that is been created on the design team, and my focus is design systems and what we're kind of trying to call core platform, or how does Reddit, what is that experience across all the different platforms that we provide. So there's the web experience with reddit.com, then there's the native apps with iOS and Android, and mobile web. And so those are our kind of big ones, trying to drive consistency across those experiences, but also thinking about where those experiences need to be divergent because they're different platforms. And so iOS should feel like an iOS app, Android feels like an Android app, and the web is the web. And I mean, getting in further into the Reddit ecosystem, there's the whole old Reddit, which is kind of an interesting can of worms, where that was the origin story, and moderators who developed their own communities would be able to actually inject their own CSS styling,
Wow.
even some JavaScript into the front end of their page to do custom look and feels. And so that's one of the biggest challenges we're trying to preserve. How do we preserve that
Right.
customization, freedom of kind of expression of your community, while also being consistent? There's some communities that custom their styling to be the ugliest UI you could build, but they also make it inaccessible to people who might have color blindness,
Right.
or difficulties using a mouse. So that's some of the challenges we're trying to work through right now. Is defining a design system that works across platform, has coded components that can be used by different teams to excel developer efficiency. So when there's a new feature or new area of the app being designed, we don't have to redesign tabs and make them new again, or make a different button, for example. So taking care of all the boring stuff and making it automated.
Right. Yeah, talking about design systems, I feel like over the last, and I'm not sure how long, I want to say maybe 3, 4, 5 or so years, I had the feeling that design systems became more and more, like much more and much more popular, and much more a thing where, although the value should be quite apparent, maybe wasn't initially, and now companies and stakeholders seem to see the value of it more clearly, I find.
Yes.
And then, they're really experts growing in this field. And I guess together with all the ever-changing design tools, ever-changing possibilities.
Yes.
And I find this is really a really interesting topic. And I think something I personally probably don't know enough about yet. So this is actually something I'm really curious about. So can you talk a little bit more about design systems?
Sure. Design systems are an interesting beast. And I've just read an article this morning that I can share after with you, which was talking about is honestly talking about the complexity of a design system and how they're similar to hyper objects, which is a term I just learned. And hyper objects are, I think, defined by things that you can't really see in totality. You can't wrap your head around it completely. There's so many different levels of interconnected things to make up a hyperobject that it can be really hard for our brains to, tackle it without making more problems. And so having, that said, design systems, I think I'm going to try not to butcher it. Most simply it's built from, or there's a couple different ways to look at it. And one of the ways is Brad Frost, who is a big design systems advocate, wrote this book in a blog post years ago about atomic design and,
Right.
Building how design interfaces are built from atoms, molecules, organisms, and templates and pages. And you can break things down to their most simplest forms and then make that a shareable property to then build up more complex interfaces. So a new page isn't like a net new page if you're building for a website. It's actually a collection of buttons and tabs and drop downs and menus or cards and icons and type styles and color systems that you've already defined or should be consistent.
Right.
And so when we're going about developing this design system, we are trying to create logical systems at the most primitive levels first. So starting with font scales, colors, ramp systems. So similar to, material design has a set of color, steps for different hues. So there's a bunch of different hues of the rainbow, and each hue is broken into 9 or 10 different steps. And so you have those as your primitive colors, and then you define your semantic colors on top of that. What is the primary action color? What's the secondary action color? Text color, secondary text color, all of that kind of semantics. And then from those styles, you then have icons, and then those all get used into your buttons. The part that's most challenging and new to me is really making sure that what we're designing on the design system side is actually a one-to-one representation of how it is built on code. And that's where you talked about how I've floated around these technical design topics. And this one is really technical. I get to work with two really, really experienced and amazing design technologists and a team of engineers. And so we're having to make sure, the color styles that we're putting in our Figma sheets are mapped to the way that we would code up the CSS tokens.
Wow.
And so those two languages are the same. So when a designer hands off their design, they're not handing it off with a different color style than how it exists in the code system. And so thinking about how to break, I guess, design decisions down to variables that we can set. So, we have tokens for spacing and padding and color and font sizes. So all of that is built into the system. And then when we're building a drop-down menu or a toolbar, we're trying to prevent, a developer and a designer making one-off decisions like, oh, this padding should be 22. Rather, it's padding medium or padding large. And that is all built into the grid. And then it gets, that's the more primitive level. And then we get into designing those components. And then on the code side, those components are created with the primitive token styles. And then we make sure they're accessible and can work with different languages. And there's documentation around it. And so we're also providing documentation for the rest of the team of how to use these different components. So really quickly, you kind of get into this weird world where the design system is a product itself and the customer is the other people in your organization. It's an interesting challenge, and then also a challenge not to get stuck in the task of being a production designer. So sometimes I find, I'm just cleaning up Figma libraries. It's not something I really want to be doing all the time, but by making sure that the libraries are all clean, it means that the other designers are building things out of the box that we have code for rather than creating net new things all the time. And I guess that does get into the whole topic that's about contribution. And that's where it gets really, really interesting. And I know we talked about what is a non-typical designer thing, but designing process is a huge part that I've learned about design systems. How do people contribute to the process or contribute to the design system? And what's that process to get those components signed off and approved and kind of all of that.
Right. So if you work on design systems, I often find, and I don't know enough about design systems. I feel, I need to learn more about it. This is one topic I really want to look into. But so what would you say if somebody says, yeah, but if you have a design system, then you basically limit all the designers in the sense of, oh, but these are all the kind of patterns, let's say we have. I can't make anything new, but I'm pretty sure that's obviously not true, right? Yeah. So how would you answer that?
That's a great question. I think it's one of the most common misconceptions with design system, but it's one that we're dealing with as well. Stakeholders not wanting to, or apprehensive of it because is it taking away from the innovation potential?
Right.
And I think that the answer would be, when you're defining these things at different levels and different scopes, so something as root as type scale in the grid spacing, and then up to something more complex like a card design or a panel design. At each level, I think we want to bake in optionality so that, our buttons, they might look one way, but they're built to allow for different radiuses of or corner radiuses. Maybe there's a squared button or a pill button. There's all these different states built into it and different appearance options, whether or not it has an icon or not. And so it's really, I think, that balance of having the system allow for options, and the documentation is more about guidance versus on the part that I don't think people like about design systems, which is governance and strict rules around using certain things. And that's something that is an ongoing challenge, but is more of a conversation, I guess, and how we work with the different teams is, it's not so much about saying this is how it's built and it cannot change, but we have a button and it's been built and coded. So can it work for your use case? Do you just want to style it a different color? That's great. Cool. Let's do it. Just pass a different color token into the button. That's not something that is restricted. I would say one of the things that's been interesting to watch on the design system side is the advancement of tools and seeing tools like Figma come along.
Right.
It's like, I guess design systems are more easier to be represented on the code side than they are on the design tool.
Right.
And so in old tools like Sketch, or even if we go back further to like Illustrator, we didn't really have like a way to share files and share components. You'd toss a file back and forth. There was a concept of symbols back in the day in Illustrator, and you'd be able to share and underline, I guess, a symbol or like a button, but there wasn't a good way to upload those or manage them or have different sub options within them. And then Sketch had this idea of, I guess they were shared symbols as well, and Figma changed that to call them components. But somewhere along the line, the tools on the design side got advanced enough that they could replicate what code is able to do. And I think that's where I was trying to go with that sentence, was that we're kind of at the state now, which is really exciting with tools like Figma, that you can actually get really, really close to building a component like it would exist in the coded world. So you have a button and it has auto layout set. So Figma has this new feature of auto layout, which essentially wraps a container around a set of elements and puts it into a row or a column. So it's like a flex box. And then you can define the gap between those items and the padding around those items, and whether or not they use the space between or they're packed. And so it's getting really, really close to how a developer would actually code up a Flexbox unit or use the Flex display settings.
Right.
So you can do that in the design software, and then you can package that as a component and then create a bunch of variants off of that component and name those variants for all the different states or options and configurations that you could do to that button. So at the end of the day, you're actually shipping one button to the end user, and then in the right-hand panel, they have all these built-in drop-down menus and switches and toggles that they can use to flip between the different types of button configurations without actually having to break that component. So it's able to deliver that optionality like you would actually have it in the code, which is really cool and really exciting. But also, it's like a cycle, I guess. It's like an interesting feedback loop of what is design systems, what can the design tool do, and it feedbacks from there, because it gets into a whole wide world of designing plugins as well. So Figma just had their Schema conference last week, which was the conference they had on design systems. And it was interesting to see that, Netflix showed off their design system, and they have a plugin that they built and coded that you can open up in Figma, and you can make any rectangle you draw a poster of a movie and pull in translated graphics. And so like Squid Game, you can pull in the direct Korean translations graphics into your rectangles through the plugin that they've built. So
amazing.
That's where I'm trying to put words around. Design systems are kind of weird in that, I guess, as the tools grow, the definition of design systems grow, and it kind of feeds back on itself.
Wow, that sounds really intriguing. I really have to learn more about design systems. Thanks so much for sharing that, Josh. But that again sounds like a really complex topic, which I guess in your case is really up your alley, so it's perfect. But so, I don't know, I'm not sure how to ask a question, but I find or maybe a very broad question. Do you have to be a senior designer to be able of doing these things?
That's a good question. I think there's the level of production work that has to be done on managing a design system, which can be feeling tedious. I guess it is can be not the best use of my time, but yeah, I think being a senior really helps defining design systems, because at the end of the day, what we're doing is trying to deliver a set of tools and processes that can be used to make our coworkers, designers and developers and engineers, their lives easier and faster. And so we have to have some experience with, what is the process of getting something ready to be built and building that UI spec sheet, handing it off. What does an engineer need to build a feature? Having all of that kind of experience accounted for in different ways of how feature development works. But that's, I should also say that's where it becomes design systems are really a collaborative effort, because at the end of the day, the feature designers are the end users and they should have a say in how the system works because it needs to work for them.
Right. So talk about senior designers. There's sometimes I see things online where when they talk about hiring, hiring junior designer, but needs to have 5 years of experience, which of course is a joke, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I feel that I often meet, I want to say somewhere between junior and mid-level designers who seem to be very keen on becoming a senior designer. And for me, it's always very hard to actually to say or to define what is a senior designer, what traits does a senior designer have?
Yeah.
Or should have, and I know some people who say, I would never promote anybody to senior designer who has not at least 10 years of experience. And sure, that sounds like very mathematical, I almost want to say. But to me, it's I don't think it works like that. You cannot just sit there for 10 years and do all the same things for 10 years without growth and suddenly become a senior designer. Obviously, that doesn't work. Mm-hmm. But in your experience, what does it take? How do you become a senior designer? What are the areas you think somebody like a mid-level designer, let's say, should focus on? And I'm sure it depends on the area they work in and all these things, totally fair. But are there any areas, in your opinion, a mid-level designer should focus on to be on track to become a senior designer?
Yeah, I believe designer to senior designer is dealing with the level of ambiguity that you have to navigate. I think that is what I've come to understand as the badge of honor that you get when you become a senior, is that you can be given less and less guidance of how to get a thing done, right, or what you have to do or what the problem is. And your job is to figure out what the real problem is. And then where it gets above, I guess, the senior staff and seniors as well, is influencing other people to rally behind your project, the thing that you're wanting to do, and to say that it's valuable. And something else that I think comes to mind with, what makes a senior designer is becoming more aware and mindful of what else exists outside of the design organization, right, in your company. What does a product manager have to do? How are they getting measured? What are their performance indicators? What's the life of an engineer? What do they have to do? Data science, like working more cross-functionally and understanding how you can get their goals achieved by being a designer and helping to lead in that respect. So I'd say like the higher you go up on the ladder of a designer, the less design you actually do, and the more influence and not people management. Management is a different kind of track, I'd say, but right, just to become a senior designer, you need to work with more people that are not just designers and figure out how to design process and make ambiguous things less ambiguous.
That's very well said. And I must say, I spend most of my time, I find I want to say, in email software and
Yes,
PowerPoint or slides or these kind of things, and
exactly.
my calendar is usually full of meetings, just talking to people. And sometimes my daughter asks, what do you do all day? And I really wonder sometimes, what do I do all day? I often just talk to people about things, and it's not even often design things, it's like, I want to say business things or generally product things. And I guess the question also is, I mean, is this suitable for every designer?
Mm,
And I think what you mentioned just now, like management track and like individual contributor track, these are different things. And people can be junior, mid, senior, and super high up in both areas. It
mhm.
doesn't necessarily mean somebody has to, I want to say, lead a team just to advance on the career ladder. But to me, also the question is like, how does somebody advance, I guess, right? And
Yeah.
I guess it comes back to, it depends on the company, depends on the product, on the circumstances, obviously on the manager and other factors, I guess. But yeah, I think I'm always curious about how do different companies approach these kind of things, like how do they, and I want to say measure is actually the wrong word, but
Mm,
what kind of what's a good way of phrasing it? Like how do they implement that? Yeah, growth as a designer, how do they
yeah.
approach it? And how do they, yeah, I guess measure it to a degree, and how do they give feedback to the people? It's like, oh, you should really focus on these areas a little bit more, you're
Mhm.
already great in these kind of areas, like these kind of things. And
Yeah.
when I think about it in my personal experience, I think this is something I personally lacked for many, many years, because I find I rarely got this kind of feedback. It
Mhm.
was just, I don't know, back in the day, I want to say in air quotes, is once a year you meet with your manager, he gives you some kind of artificial rating, I want to say, and then, well, gee, thanks, that comes all 12 months too late basically now, because it's not real time, obviously.
Yeah.
And then you have like these kind of, I don't know, points you really want to focus on now, and then you try to work on things addressing these kind of things, but maybe you neglect other things, and then 12 months later you get some kind of review again. It's like, oh great, now I'm good there now, but I'm not so good somewhere else. And yeah, I don't know, do you have any thoughts or like your experience in different companies? What's a good way of enabling people to grow, like designers to grow?
So I guess in the three big companies that I've been at, each one does it differently. And they have, the ladders, as they call them, so different levels. Google is notorious with their ladders. They have a system where I think entry level is level 3, and it goes up to a level 9, I think, is like high level VP executive. But a level 5 is a senior. Level 6 is kind of equivalent to a staff. And level 7 is very influential senior staff person. So that's kind of, I guess, one way. So there's all these different levels. And then grading for at Google and at Reddit, and I think at SAP, you'll probably know more than me because you were my manager after all. But so at Google, we had 3 different ways of being evaluated or 4 different ways. We had impact. So what was the actual impact we had on the business? And that kind of had to get broken down to almost like a dollar. Like, what were we able to ship that provided X amount of change in our metrics? And did it make any money? And then
Wow.
we had difficulty. So, how difficult was the problem that we were solving? Can you speak to that difficulty and get people to, reinforce? So, your peers. And then there was actual contributions, so the things that you did, and the last one was community. So what things you're doing outside of your kind of day-to-day job. Reddit's very similar in that respect. I think there was one extra special column, but it's kind of, generally, how hard is the problem you're solving? How much guidance did you have going into it? Was it a blank, open-ended, figure it out problem, or was it defined by research, defined by the director, and you just had to execute? And then, was it successful? Did it actually move a metric, have impact? Which can be a tough thing to be evaluated on, because it can create some interesting cultural kind of what would you call blowback, where people are just hunting for impact and not really doing things because we should.
Right.
And so having a really structured evaluation to be graded on is useful. I liked it rather than just going open-ended for a year. But Google went pretty extreme in that every 6 months we were evaluated, and we had to write essentially a report about everything we did and why it mattered and get it peer reviewed by people we worked with. And they would attest to the things we did. And then it would get evaluated in a committee outside of your manager, and they would grade you and give you that grade. And that would be how you grow in the company. So their whole system was about removing bias from your manager or people that might negatively impact your roles. So you weren't getting, just because you have a bad relationship with your manager, they can't really do that much to limit you, or the vice versa. You can't brown nose your manager and have them give you a promotion, because that promotion has to be vetted at a committee level and it's like evaluated, kind of like a university. Now, their system is built to account for what's called the Peter principle. And it's that classic example where you are doing a great job, you're doing amazing at the job you're currently doing, you're exceeding your expectations, so they give you a promotion. And you go into the next job, your duties change a little bit, your responsibilities change. But, you start to kill it after 6 months, and you're exceeding those expectations. So the company's like, wow, you're amazing, Josh. And they throw you another promotion. Eventually, in the old model, or I guess the classic model, you eventually get a promotion up until the point that you cannot do your job anymore. Right. You plateau because it's like the skill ceiling for the new job is higher than what you were previously doing, which can get into tough situations. Where with the Peter principle, in trying to account for that, it's at Google, we had to prove that we were doing the next level job. And the promotion was almost a acknowledgement of, yes, you were doing that.
Right.
So now you're promoted. So it ensured that people were not promoted early, and they were promoted when they, were already doing that next level job. And then they had to strive for the next one. And the downsides there is it can feel a little bit like you're not getting compensated for the job you're actually doing, because you might be doing 50% of the next level up job, but you're not really doing 100% yet. So that can be a tough negative side to that system as well. But I guess like going back to the ambiguity part, that's what I would kind of go back to, is like at every level, it's just about doing the same job with less information and still be consistent, hit success, and help the company make money, or whatever the goals are. Making money. It's always there. Someone has to make the money.
I guess so. But that's really interesting to hear and to learn about these kind of experiences. Because I remember I used to be at some companies where there was almost a saying that they say, oh, at this company, they always make the same mistake. They always promote the best individual contributors to become the worst managers.
Yes,
and it just felt so true. You had an expert, I don't know, an expert developer who was really good at what they were doing, like, wow, mind-blowing work, and then as a manager, they were just not, I want to say a people person in that sense, and why would they be? I mean, they used to be so really good as an engineer. How can you imagine, like, why would the same person also have this other skill set out of the pocket kind of thing?
Yes.
And it makes total sense. And it happened again and again, it was almost like a running joke. And it's like what you described, that makes perfect sense. I also remember one of my managers telling me many years ago, you should actually behave like you were at the level you want to be at. Not like you are whatever level designer now, but and it sounds so simplistic, right? It's like,
Mm-hmm.
just do what you would do if you were already promoted. But of course, that comes with lots of questions. How can I do this? My boss asked this and this for me. How can I now overperform on this thing? It's a very specific task,
Yeah.
And I guess it changes over time with seniority, right? Because then suddenly things are less tangible, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
than they used to be. And then maybe it's easier to go above and beyond. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
sure.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'm kind of feeling that right now where my boss is saying, Josh, what do you want to do? Like, you tell me what you want to do and where are the projects that we need to work on. So I think that's part of it. And it's nice to have a manager that supports me in that way.
For sure. So now that we are in the pandemic still, unfortunately,
Yes.
how is working in the pandemic for you? I mean, we talked about it earlier a little bit, no commute,
Mhm.
bedroom, living room kind of thing. But how do you work, I don't know, with your manager? How do you work with your peers? I guess everything kind of is online. And as far as I know, Reddit usually was already before the pandemic, embracing working remotely. But
Mhm.
I mean,
Mhm.
there's ways of working. I guess there's really good ways of working remotely, and there's,
Mhm.
oh, now we scramble and find some software so we can throw people into a online meeting room kind of thing, but it doesn't really work. Do you have any tips and tricks how you work remotely and what works for you and your team?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's been a hard time. It's not easy. I think meet regularly, having a lot of nice one-on-ones or team meetings to talk is really important,
Right.
especially onboarding to Reddit, where I don't know that many people, just trying to book time with different folks just to chat. One strategy we've used, which is a simple one, but is just making it so our calendars default to a 15-minute meeting rather than a 30-minute meeting.
Ah,
A tip I learned for like meeting management is every 15 minutes, you should strive for one decided thing. So, one action item, one conclusion per 15 minutes.
hmm,
So, if you have a half an hour meeting, you have to decide on two things. If you have an hour meeting, we should be deciding on four things. Kind of like a nice goal to strive for. It doesn't usually work out that way, but it's like a mental model I like to use for how much time we're booking in the day. We use Slack a lot. And then the last thing I'd probably say with remote work is just trying to be mindful and aware of how we can do things async. So, how can we get feedback on a design, on an idea, or any sort of topic outside of the regular meeting hours? So that might be writing a Google document and then throwing it around for comments so people can just peruse it at their time that's available, because some people have kids, some people are running around, other people sleep in, and so how can we do things a little bit more async and then come together when it's really needed and necessary? And then tools like Figma are great on the design side for being able to work collaboratively, because we can be there, see each other's mice and follow along and doing all of that. So, yeah, I think those are the big tips that come to my mind for working remotely. But it's not easy. It's pretty tough.
Yeah, I must say I kind of miss going to the office. I mean,
Yeah.
I understand and I also enjoy working remotely, don't get me wrong, but sometimes I just miss going to the office. I don't know, just like going from my desk to the kitchen, meeting somebody on the way, chatting for, I don't know, even if it's only 2 minutes
Yeah.
about something, not even, maybe not even work related, but just catching up. And I find this is really difficult, or maybe I just haven't found the right way. But I find currently my situation is very difficult to do this online
Mhm.
because, of course, people need focus time and to actually get their work done.
Yep.
So maybe I just haven't found the right tool yet, but I wish there was something where you could almost like replicate this kind of situation.
Yeah, I agree. That would be nice. I miss those like water cooler talks and just
Yeah.
the social aspects of work, and being new at Reddit. It can be kind of lonely, some days without, if I don't have any meetings, I'm just like, okay, that was a quiet day with not a lot of talks outside of the stand up.
Yeah.
Um, one app that we've been using, or I guess it's welcome in the company, but not everyone uses it, which is interesting, called Clockwise. It is a time management calendar assistant that you plug into your Google Calendar, and you can set it to carve away lunchtime, but it will also put down focus hour time blocks on your calendar, and you can give it a goal of how much focus time you want for the week. And then if multiple people are using the plugin, it will consolidate and manage meetings to be a little bit more, I guess, respectful of people's calendars. So instead of having like a sync and then maybe a half an hour break and then another sync and then another hour break and then a sync, it will figure out how they can actually group meetings to be back to back to back. And then you're done for after an hour and a half and then can focus. So Clockwise, it's an interesting app to use.
Oh, wow. That sounds really interesting. I will definitely look that up.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Okay, that was really interesting, Josh. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
I learned a lot today, and I will put a bunch of links in the show notes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, where can people find out more about you? Do you have a website? Are you on LinkedIn or something?
Yeah, thanks. People can find me on my website, which is joshchisholm.com. And then on LinkedIn, you can just find me by Joshua Chisholm. And I should be coming up. I guess I'll be the designer that works at Reddit.
Perfect. Awesome. Josh, thank you so much for being on the show. It was fantastic catching up with you. I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang. It was a pleasure chatting again and talking about these topics that I'm pretty passionate about. So thanks so much.
Thanks so much for listening. We really hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, would you give us a rating on iTunes? It really makes a difference and we'd truly appreciate it. Got any questions? Then get in touch by following us on Twitter at Pixelish_HQ. Thanks again for listening. I'm Wolfgang Bremer and this was Pixelish.